partially on Zoom and partially here. In addition, we have two of our authors accompanying us in the presential room, and Jorge Sanchez from Boston University, and Oscar Caballero, who's from Nicaragua and was one of the student protesters in 2018 who started it all. So, welcome. We are having translation today. You can, if you're watching this hybrid distance, you can just press the little button at the bottom of your screen to get translation, Spanish, English, or Portuguese. If you're here in the room and you don't understand the language that's being spoken in, you can use your phone with appropriate headsets to use the same thing. If you don't have a link, you can get the link on from the DRCLAS website. I think most people in the room are bilingual, but if you're not, that's a way to listen. The issue on animals is the most multidisciplinary issue that I've ever done. We've brought together literature, biology, film, sociology, law. Law is actually a very big part of history, and from many different countries, from Cuba, Nicaragua, Chile, Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Santo Domingo, the United States, Mexico. And I do hope that if you haven't had a chance to read it, that you will. So our moderator for tonight is Germán Vergara. He is the Cisneros visiting scholar at DRCLAS. In his real life, he's an assistant professor of history with the School of History and Sociology at Georgia Tech. And today, he gave me a copy of the very new paperback edition. It's been in hardcover for a year, of his book, Fueling Mexico. And he's here working on a book project, Becoming History, Species Extinctions and Capitalism in Latin America since 1800. And just like the ReVista issue, he is exploring all the interconnected economic, political, social, and environmental factors that have caused animal population declines and species loss in the region over the past 2 centuries, which is what he wrote about for ReVista. I turn it over to you, Germán, and thank you.
Thank you, June. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to the launch of the Winter 2023 issue, which, if you have had the chance to look at it, offers a panoramic view of animals in Latin America. We have a really exciting lineup of panelists. Each speaker will have about 10 to 12 minutes to present, and as a designated timekeeper, I'll gently remind you when your time is nearly up. After the panels, we'll open up the session to the authors so that they can ask or answer questions from other panelists. Then we'll open the floor to the audience for a Q&A with the panelists. Our first speaker is Macarena Montes Franceschini, who is a visiting fellow at the Brooks McCormick Junior Animal Law and Policy Program at Harvard Law School. Macarena is an attorney with a PhD in law from Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. Her research focuses on non-human personhood and animal rights. She has written several articles and at least a book titled Derecho Animal en Chile, Animal Law in Chile, published in 2018. Macarena, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. Thank you for the invitation. And also, I really enjoyed writing one of the articles for ReVista. I'm very happy to be in Cambridge, but at the same time being in a room full of people interested in animal-related issues, as well as what's going on in Latin America with this topic. So today I will talk about a woolly monkey whose rights were severely violated throughout her life at the hands of humans. But despite this, this case caught the attention of the highest court in Ecuador, opening the door for a new path to argue for animal rights in this country and in Latin America. So this was Estrellita, a woolly monkey who lived with a human family since she was 1 month old in a city called Ambato in Ecuador. Poachers probably shot her mother dead. Estrellita probably fell from the treetops hanging on to her dead mother's corpse. And when they fell to the ground, she was probably ripped away from her mother, stuffed in a box, and then sold at an illegal wildlife market. Estrellita lived like a human child for 18 years until somebody anonymously informed the environmental authority that there was a monkey living in a private home. So she was confiscated in 2019 because the Ecuadorian Organic Code of the Environment prohibits breeding, selling, and buying wild animals. So the authority confiscated Estrellita and they quarantined her in a zoo. She died there less than a month after she arrived. The autopsy indicated that she died from a cardiorespiratory arrest, and the autopsy was issued by the same vet that evaluated Estrellita when she arrived to the zoo. So probably Estrellita didn't arrive in the best conditions to the zoo because she was a wild animal that had been living as a pet for 18 years, but being put in a zoo led to her quick death. Before learning about her death, Estrellita's human family filed a habeas corpus on behalf of Estrellita to get her back, and also asked for a wildlife license so they could keep her at home. The lower court and the Court of Appeals denied the habeas corpus because they argued that this action can only be filed on behalf of humans, and also that the environmental authority acted according to the law when they confiscated her and put her in quarantine in a zoo. In other similar habeas corpus cases regarding animals, the case would have ended at this point, but not in Estrellita's case, because in this case, the Ecuadorian Constitutional Court selected the case to develop binding jurisprudence on animal rights, even though Estrellita had died. So in 2021, an Ecuadorian attorney contacted the Non-Human Rights Project and the Brooks McCormick Jr. Animal Law and Policy Program here at Harvard, inviting them to file an amicus brief to the Constitutional Court regarding the rights of animals. So the Non-Human Rights Project worked on the part of the amicus that focused on the habeas corpus. And Professor Kristen Stilt from Harvard Law School and I worked on the part that focuses on the rights of nature and their relationship with animal rights. Our initial thoughts when we heard about the case and the possibility of filing an amicus was that it was going to be a very hard case to win because Estrellita had died. And as I mentioned, usually in habeas corpus cases, the animal is still alive in a zoo, for example, or in a lab. And also because environmental law and the rights of nature had always focused on the protection of species, but not on individual animals. And in this case, we were talking about one woolly monkey named Estrellita. So the court wanted to answer certain questions, and the court didn't know much about animal rights because this is a new topic. And so the court wanted the amici to answer those 3 questions you can see on the PowerPoint. So can an animal be considered as a subject of rights? What is the scope of the writ of habeas corpus in relation to other living beings? And can non-human animals be considered as subjects of rights protected by the rights of nature according to the Ecuadorian Constitution? So in our amicus, we responded, 1, that animals can be the subjects of rights. 2, that the habeas corpus can be an appropriate appropriate mechanism for animals. And 3, that non-human animals are subjects of rights protected by the rights of nature. Even though we knew it was difficult, our main objective when answering question 3 was to convince the Constitutional Court that the rights of nature protect individual animals, not only species. So this was probably the most important aspect of the whole amicus brief, because species protection has not been able to stop the mass extinction of animals. And every day there are billions of animals suffering and dying from poaching, hunting, habitat loss, drought, among many other issues that we all know that are affecting the planet and that are not only affecting humans, but also animals. So our main arguments to claim that the rights of nature include individual animals were 2. First, species are made up of individuals. So hunting or poaching individuals detrimentally affects the species, the community, or the population. So for example, in some Amazonian regions, there are 10 jaguars left. So if we kill one jaguar, we're destroying 10% of the jaguar population. However, killing and capturing individual animals doesn't only affect species but that are endangered, but species that may be vulnerable or not endangered. For example, woolly monkeys like Estrellita are very sensitive to human presence in their habitat. So when there's poachers or hunters in the area, their reproductive cycles become affected. And the reproductive cycles are already slow because normally they have one infant at a time, and woolly monkey mothers invest several years in raising their infants. Additionally, research has shown that countless animals live in complex societies and develop deep emotional bonds with other members of their communities. So hunting and poaching causes extreme suffering in these groups because it destroys families and tears friendships apart. So researchers have long established that chronic stress is physically and mentally detrimental to animals, leaving them vulnerable to other pathologies like depression, infections, among other things. The point is that we actually don't know who we're killing when we hunt and poach. We may be killing a mother that is caring for several infants, so we're leaving those infants without any protection as orphans, or we may be poaching infants and leaving many mothers with psychological problems or an affected immune system due to the loss, because researchers have also shown that many animal species have grief when they lose a loved one. We may be also, for example, killing a matriarch or an alpha male who is a very important figure within that animal community, because the community depends on that individual for their survival or stability. Finally, we may be killing animals that belong to the same family, so we're destroying the genetic diversity, and so we may be leaving siblings behind who will not mate. And our second argument was that if the Ecuadorian Constitutional Court decided, hey, you know what, individual animals aren't protected by the rights of nature, it would be forced to make an impossible decision. How many deaths or captures would trigger the rights of nature? 2, 10, 100, 1,000? And this obviously would let hunters easily bypass the protection of the rights of nature that appears in the Ecuadorian Constitution. So when we read the Ecuadorian court's judgment, we couldn't believe it, because 7 out of the 9 judges decided to recognize Estrellita as a subject of rights protected by the constitutional rights of nature. And as you can imagine, these are the most important judges in the country we're talking about. So the court took into consideration all the arguments we advanced in our amicus and recognized that the rights of nature does not only protect ecosystems and species, but also individual animals. So you can imagine that this was a huge win for us and obviously for the animal rights movement. It was also very relevant because the court symbolically repaired the suffering that was committed by humans to Estrellita throughout her life. So the court recognized that Estrellita's rights were violated in 3 different moments: when she was poached and separated from her family and taken from her habitat, when she was forced to live as a pet for 18 years with a human family, and then when she was just confiscated and stuck in a zoo without considering her particular circumstances, her story, her unique biography. The Constitutional Court not only recognized animals in general as right holders, but also talked about some specific rights that wild animals might have because the case originated with a wild animal, Estrellita, but actually these rights can apply to a much broader group of animals, such as the right not to be hunted, the right to habitat, the right to the free development of the animal behavior, among others. Regarding the habeas corpus, the court said, and this was also very important, because it said that it can be an appropriate action to request the release of a captive animal, but it will depend on the circumstances. And then the court, using the powers it has, it ordered the Ministry of Environment to develop a protocol that would apply to confiscated animals to consider their particular circumstances. But also the court ordered the Ombudsman and Congress to draft a bill on animal rights that should apply the principles of this ruling. So even though the Constitutional Court also offered arguments to defend the human consumption of animals, Estrellita's ruling has had a general positive effect in Ecuador and has opened the door to argue for animal rights through the rights of nature in Latin America. So in Ecuador, lower court judges have started using Estrellita's ruling not only to protect wild animals, but also companion animals. So we can already see its expansive effects. Additionally, animal rights attorneys and legal practitioners in the country are using the ruling and also in general, the general framework of the rights of nature to advance animal rights in that country. In other countries in the region, animal rights advocates are starting to view the rights of nature as an option to argue for animal rights in court. They are also starting to collaborate with the groups that focus on promoting the rights of nature. So we can see that now these two groups that have been quite distant now are starting to collaborate and working together. And finally, these issues of the rights of nature and the rights of animals are topics that are starting to be incorporated into constitutional convention debates, such as, for example, the case of Chile. So thank you for the invitation, and I'll be happy to answer your questions during the Q&A, and that's my email if anybody wants to contact me.
Thank you, Macarena. Our second panelist is Erika Lucero Robles Cortés. She's an archaeologist at the Instituto Nacional de Antropología y Historia in Mexico. Her research interests include Mesoamerica, zoo archaeology, cremation, religion, and ritual. She was a researcher with the Templo Mayor project from 2009 to 2021. In 2022, she published Los cocodrilos, símbolos de la tierra, en las ofrendas del Templo Mayor. Bienvenida, Erika. She's there, right? Yep. Oh, she's there.
I don't see her.
Hello.
Oh,
hi. Erika is actually having internet issues, so she'll be joining us shortly.
So is that Marcia?
This is Darinette, but
okay.
We can proceed with the next panelist.
Okay, so well, our third speaker is Diego Plaza Casanova. Diego has a Master of Laws from the Lewis and Clark Law School. Diego is founder and director of the Center for Animal Law Studies, CEDA, Chile, as well as founder and president of the Fundación Justicia Interespecie, or Interspecies Justice Foundation, an NGO dedicated to advancing the interests of humans and non-humans. As a legal scholar, Diego is a contributor to the Handbook on Global Animal Law, forthcoming with Oxford University Press. Diego, are you there?
Hi, everyone. How are you doing? I cannot activate my video. Yeah, it seems like the host stopped my video, according to this message I'm reading right now. Okay, well, thank you so much for inviting me to write an article for ReVista, and thank you so much for inviting me also to this panel. I will talk a little bit about my article, but I will do it in Spanish, so it will be easier for all the Spanish-speaking attendees to understand what I'm talking about. Bueno.
Okay, so this invitation was so interesting for me to write an article for ReVista. For me, it was great, you know. Thank you, Harvard, for this honor. And also because specifically I was invited to talk about my experience as, you know, animal rights defender. And really this leads me to the, you know, it's the first time I've ever been invited to something like this, right? To talk about animals. And this is amazing, you know? Also, I think that it's interesting for the readers, people that are reading ReVista specifically, because the reader can get an idea about how can we do a legal exercise in this sector and thus be able to relate to all the subjective experiences that we've had in a way as a professional exercise, just like animal rights are. So without further ado, I will talk a bit more about my article. I divided it in two sections. The first one is the circumstances that led me to animal rights, and then it extended for 20 years or so, and then the different crucial moments that have defined my professional career. So both the first and the second parts are related to the successes. And that's why when you know, this is a common thread that I'll be talking about in my speech. So I'm going to talk about my successes. My successes are like a carriage pulled by, it's a chariot that is pulled by horses. And these were used, you know, as a means of public transport, you know, and it was a very wealthy environment that used these chariots to carry people around with horses pulling it. In the Myanmar city, they used it as means of transportation for tourists. And this, and you know, Villa del Mar is a very touristic city in Chile, and Victorias, that's how they're called over there, became a crucial part of the city, right? Touristically speaking. So this led me to, you know, animal rights. So the first one was my early contact just when I was a child with these, because they always made me feel uncomfortable, uneasy, very sad situation. I couldn't help the horses because, you know, at that time I was a kid. I didn't have the tools to defend the animals. But I remember asking adults, why do they keep using these horses for this, you know, mistreating animals? You know, these horses were falling down completely ill, you know, old, exhausted, dehydrated, and almost, you know, always there was a wave of, you know, citizen miscontempt. They weren't happy about it, and then they finally decided to do something about it. The second important moment was when I was studying law in the Valparaiso University, and I was invited to be a part of a group of students that would study animals. And that's the first time that we Animal Freedom by Peter Singing, who talked about, you know, animals as, you know, rights, as animals or beings that deserve rights. So that's the first time I started seeing that in official texts. The second one was when I was finishing law school, and I ended up being in a small street in, you know, in a street. I saw a horse that was malnourished. It was completely ill. And I was like, this was a moment when I was older, right? And I was face to face with this horse that was completely, you know, mistreated. And that's when I knew I had to work. I had to dedicate my life to animals, and you know, and that's the moment. That's a crucial point in my life. It was very inspiring for me. And then in 2019, that's when Luisa Clark, and I did my animal rights law degree after that. The first thing that I did with Lewis and Clark was to do research about what were the Victorias, you know, the history about it, the infraction to the laws for animal well-being. So I contacted organizations that wanted to abolish these forms of mistreatment for animals, and I started to, you know, go with different groups that were conformed by veterinarians, public information, advocates. And then in my hands, after some weeks, I had a very full investigation, right? And I started like a campaign trying to get some legal recourses to really fight this. And then I thought, maybe if there was an institution behind this research, maybe we would have a public forum so that discussion could be out there, right, in the public. And if I hadn't presented that with law students, it wouldn't have been so easy. So that's why I founded the Animal Rights Foundation, Legal Rights Foundation. So this was a specialized, you know, foundation for research. In November 2019, we started that through that, spread that through the media and send it to a Victoria para Viña. And after many years, we started to free the Victorias, so these chariots pulled by horses, and really we started to apply it to different municipalities, not only in Villa del Mar, but in other municipalities, so that municipalities would respond back about these infractions towards animal well-being. A week later, um, the fiscal, they started to create, they asked for a meeting, right, to discuss the need to forbid this animal rights infraction. And then we started to present that officially. And unexpectedly, after that meeting, the municipality took the historical decision to annul every and in 2020, after more than 100 years of existence, Victoria's stopped existing. You know, they freed, you know, that situation. So actively, I participated in many campaigns. I was in favor of all the different things that were happening. After the campaign and intervention we had with this, we studied and continued to develop interesting work with different animals. We promoted different legal resources for environmental justice, animal protection. And what we try to do is create precedent to talk about post-abolitionism in animal rights. We also had experts in very well positioned that we weekly publish news, regional, even world news about animal rights. And through these social media, we've organized academic, you know, events. The first seminar for animal rights in Chile, that's it's together with the most prestigious legal university over there. So, you know, we have different forums, not only presential, but also, you know, online, about talking about this animal problematic. We also have intersectional work with different experts and seeing it from a literary perspective, and not only legal, but also literary. So that is great, you know, with a collective, you know, we have certain animal studies that have been done transversally with different, you know, disciplines, intersectional with different, you know, careers. And that's been super interesting. The first volume, it's already, you know, it's fresh, ready to be launched. Next Saturday, we're launching a book. So you're all invited. And thank you. Thank you. Oh, and oh yeah, and then we started wondering, can we do more for animals? And we started to think maybe we can develop some sort of, you know, activism. And so we thought maybe through SEDA Chile, it would be contraproducent, right? It wouldn't lead us somewhere. So we decided to found, you know, the Interespecie no, in 2001, we decided to create the Interspecies Justice Foundation. So this Interspecies Justice Foundation, it was the first time when we created this habeas corpus for protection of an animal that was actually in a zoo. And we managed to have a communicational impact. For example, to CNN, we were in different big outlets. Sadly, the habeas corpus wasn't admitted by the San Miguel Court and the Supreme Court. Nevertheless, two positive conclusions were actually came out. They gave us different paths to free the animals. And it was a bit weird because the ruling declared that the indictment wasn't a person because only humans could be people or beings, but that they knew that this animal was deprived of its freedom, and that's something that they actually acknowledged. So from there on, we started to find new legal ways, and then this ruling, was impacted in every school, legal school, and also tribunal. Also through the foundation, we created educational activities in different points of the city, not specified, not technical. We've trained different people regarding animal rights in the Centro de Apoderado de Escuelas, Centro de Estudiantes de Universidades. So all university students, we created the first course, in Universidad de Rabieta, which is a municipal university. And recently we inaugurated the legal area that is right now working, and we're trying to promote this area for legal, it has everything to do with the Interspecies Justice Foundation. So this is for animal rights and also animal literature. Currently, we face many challenges. And with that, I'll conclude, because the biggest challenge we have is the need to professionalize the work we do, in different organizations. Every single person that work here are volunteers. We're not getting paid. We pay our own salaries when we can. We are dedicated to animal law, and we're trying to change that, right? Make it more professional. That's why today we created the Interspecies Justice Foundation and trying to create the most, we are gathering funds right now in order to have elemental funds in order to at least being able to pay basic salaries for some of our volunteers, and then being able to do professionalization of the scene of the animal exercise in law in our country. So in general terms, this is what I've done, but I thought I would be so happy to talk about these topics in the Q&A session, and I'm just going to respect everyone's time and leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Diego. So I'll reintroduce Erika Lucero Robles Cortés, who seems to have fixed her Wi-Fi problems. Hi, Erika. Can you hear us?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Sorry, I have problems, but I am here now. Thank you so much.
Can we see her? We can't see you.
Sorry.
No podemos verte. Eso, ahora sí.
Sorry. I have problems with my internet, but I'm so sorry, but I'm here now.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
So let me reintroduce you. So Erika is an archaeologist at INA, Instituto Nacional de Antropología y Historia, in Mexico. Her research interests include Mesoamerica, zoo archaeology, cremation, religion, and ritual. She was a researcher with the Templo Mayor project from 2009 to 2021. And in 2022, she published Los cocodrilos, símbolos de la tierra en las ofrendas del Templo Mayor. Adelante, Erika.
Hi, everyone. Well, I am very pleased to be here with all of you. And first of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation to participate in ReVista. I am so sorry for my English. I am still learning, so, well, I am sorry. And well, I want to share with you that, well, I like you say, I am an American archaeologist. And I worked for a long time in the Great Temple of Tenochtitlan. It's the most important city before the arrival of the Spaniards' conquest. And in this place was the Aztec Empire, where today is Mexico City. So my text that I published in ReVista, it's about the analysis of the fauna in this context. The archaeologist project has been excavated for about 40 years. Among the discoveries, many offerings or caches have been found. And these are deposits that the Mexica left as gifts or for their gods. So in these deposits, most of the time placed inside stone boxes, there are representations of God, instruments for self-sacrifice, the victim themselves, women, men, and children, and of course, many animal species. Most of them are exotic, coming from all over the empire, and of course from all kinds of environment, forests, jungles, mountains, seas, swamps. And for example, we can find snails, shells, fish, sharks, crocodiles, turtles, felines, many starfish, many kind of species in this place. It's awesome. And since most of the animals are exotic, it's often very difficult to analyze them, as there is generally no work on skeletal remains of skeletons. For example, we found many small pebbles, like rocks, that we didn't know what they were. Many researchers saw them like geologists, biologists, archaeologists, but nobody knew what they were until a group of biologists identify these little pieces, and they know that they are these elements are the skeleton of starfish. So it's awesome, all the things that we can find. And precisely in my text, I try to share with about all these problems that archaeologists face when analyzing archaeological materials. As I say in my text, when I decided to study the remains of the crocodiles found in the excavation of the Templo Mayor of Tenochtitlan, I was aware that I will review codices and chronicles from the 16th and 18th centuries, that I was going to consult books, drawings, reports, and spend long hours in the museum storage room examining bones. But I did not imagine that I will have the opportunity to pat crocodiles, capture them, or discover some of these of the secrets of the fur and taxidermy. And I also had no idea that research could lead me to biology, ethnology, or ethnoarchaeology. I think that on the other hand, it's very interesting, the work that we archaeologists do, because we can, with our investigations, we can have how I say, to reach the knowledge about the different species animals, and also that the people can see that many of these animals that for these cultures were very important, today are very endangered. For example, we found in our excavations wolves or sawfish, many kinds of sharks, or another kind of animals like different kind of lions that today are endangered. So I think that it's very important to have this approach about archaeology and biology. And yes, it's all.
Thank you, Erika.
Thank you.
Our last panelist is Marcia Condoy Truyenque. We can see you, and can we hear you? ¿Nos escuchas?
Yes.
We're good. I'm going to introduce you. Okay, so Marcia is a Peruvian attorney with experience in labor law, constitutional law, human rights, and animal law advocacy. Marcia has a Master of Laws from the Center for Animal Law Studies, also at Lewis and Clark School. In 2021, Marcia opened an animal law area in her law firm, where she's an associate attorney, president and firma legal, and has led procedurals that position animals as protagonists using new advocacy alternatives like the multi-species family, sentience approach, and constitutional rights. Deseo la palabra, Marcia.
Muchísimas gracias y voy a hablar en español y voy a tratar de hacer un poco lento porque
Thank you so much. I'm actually gonna speak in.
I will cancel this. So, yeah.
Thank you so much.
First, I have to say thank you so much to the Centro de Estudios Latinoamericanos David Rockefeller. Y muchas gracias a Jun
First of all, I
Carolina.
want to thank all the team in ReVista because it's amazing that I had the chance to write for you. And so today you're going to find the article in the issue. Oh, can you hear my echo? Yes. I'm sorry. Something happened with my echo, but now we're good. Yes. So the article that I wrote is called Familias Multiespecie, Multi-Species Protecting Animals, Protecting Human Rights. And I start with this article writing about Petunia. Petunia is a story that we saw in Peru. Petunia was a little pig living in a human family. And we usually know that having pigs at home is not something, accustomed or normal. Usually pigs are for human consumption. So Petunia, the pig, lived in a small apartment and neighbors took pictures from outside, showing the pig living in human quarters, and they told the municipality. So the municipality arrived to the house of the family members of Petunia with the order saying that they should take Petunia to a farm in 10 days. And if they didn't do that, they were going to decommission the animal and take him away. So the family started a constitutional legal process. This was a habeas corpus, case and they said that the municipality hadn't stated any condition to say that Petunia was a health and safety, danger. And they also argued that Petunia was a member of their family, and to take them out of their household would, affected the children and the family because she was such a crucial member of the family. So this was successful in the sense that the judge established that the family had the right to hold Petunia both in their home, but also as part of their family. And added to that, they forced the municipality to withdraw their order to take Petunia away, and they ordered to establish that they couldn't have domestic pets as that they could have her as family and as a pet. So the judge used a recourse that's interesting. It's called el derecho a libre desarrollo de la personalidad. So this right is connected or is derived from a more general legal resource that I'm actually going to mention in a bit. So let's start with the question, if animals can be actual members of a family. This is the first question I'm asking, because normally what you could argue is that it's just a human whim to have animals, to call them our children. It could be arbitrary, right? But I answer to that by saying, no, it is not. I think that, and according to what I can explain based on the article, there's some psychological research talking about multi-species families. These families are conformed by humans and other animal species with caring bonds in a horizontal and this is the definition that is given to a multi-species family. Now, why do I say that there are several reasons to really say that these multi-species families actually exist. On one side, the first reason is that human beings are actually capable of seeing our animals as our family, right? So let's start saying that we've always known that animals have been part of family life since forever, right? Since dogs were domesticated, since they've been part of our communities. But what is kind of new is the fact, and this is something like a novelty, right? It's a much more modern idea, is how much more can we do for animals that we live with? So for starters, animals that live at home with us, but we do additional financial time efforts, emotional efforts that are linked to that relationship. Every day you have to give them food, take them to the vets, you create, social media for them, you take photos of them. Historically, that never happened in the past. So now it happens. And that's the first point that will allow us to say, okay, they're developing feelings that are way deeper towards animals than in the past. Now, on top of that, and that's where I want to share something with you that Sor Pablo de la Universidad that in Buenos Aires says animals and multi-species families. He says animals that we live with, we name them, so we recognize they have a personality. We take them into account when we move away, when we move houses, so we acknowledge their existence. We call them as our children, as our brothers. We recognize them as a family category. But the question here is, when we call them children or brothers, maybe this is an anomaly in human beings because we're trying to fill in voids in our families, human families with animals. From psychology point of view, the answer is no. And so the hypothesis here is that animals are not linked to this. They're not filling in voids, but they are part of our real human family structures. And in that sense, we can see that from the psychological sense, human beings can understand the fact that we can see animals, not only see them as beings that live with us, but also as beings that are part of our family nucleus. And this could be enough for them to hold rights, right? Because animal rights are legal rights, these moral feelings, that acknowledgement we give them rights to, have rights. So this can also be done in a legal process. So animals, many animals, not every single animal, but many animals have the capacity to recognize themselves as part of that family. And in the article, you'll be able to read that many psychological research explains how animals are part of family dynamics. And I actually quoted two of them. The first one is the family triangulation. So animals, when they see two people, members of their family that are fighting, in a very stressful situation, there's a third party that intervenes to stop and to, arrest that moment of negative, for example, a person tries to separate, but in the case of dogs start barking, or, they help people, they protect the family. And the other dynamic that I thought was interesting, it was their functioning and sub-functioning, which means that in a household, in a home, when a member of the family is ill or depressed, or that person is sub-functioning, another another individual takes the burden on them, right? They're more active taking care of the other being. In the case of animals, within their reach, they try to take care of the person, to give them comfort, to be present, to cheer them up. So the conclusion is that the creation of a multi-species family, and not only it's not a psychological phenomena on behalf of humans, but it's also a bilateral kind of relationship, because some animals have also that capacity to bring back something to the family. So is it really possible to create, can we really, multi-species families exist, and that has been proven in psychology, sociology. So how does it apply to law? In legal aspects, it's a bit more complicated, and traditionally, law only understood a family as a mother, father, family that is biologic size, and where connections are first order, so meaning mom, mother, children, and that's the family, right? And especially that the couple, parents are heterosexuals. So behind all these ideas of father, mother, children, these are very conservative ideas, ideas that have been inherited with religion, the influence of church over right, over law. And all of this is changing, thankfully. So personally, I've seen that in Latin America, where we are recognizing the plurality of family structures. So for example, today, we'll be able to see that the law recognizes that a family can have two fathers, a family can be two mothers, one mother, and we can find other types of families. For example, and I quote, extended families, families where they count grandparents and cousins as part of the family nucleus, assembled families. These are families that have been formed with other ex-families. For example, a new couple brings their children on board, so they create a new family. Also homoparental families, so two fathers and two mothers. So these are much more realistic, more sensible considerations of the reality of what families are. So I think that this is also installed in Latin America, and especially because of all the Corte Interamericana and everything they've been doing to help that. There's a very specific case in Latin America. Actually, the case is called Forneron versus Argentina. So the Inter-American Court resolved the case where the Argentinian state took away daughters of a woman only because that woman was a lesbian. So in that case, the Inter-American Court said, the American Convention of Human Rights don't protect a single type of family, but the term family needs to be sold in its widest aspect, considering affective bounds that are linked to the family. So with this new legal idea that we have about families, it is possible to acknowledge multi-species families, especially if we acknowledge that the Latin American legal aspect is super flexible, because the legal panorama is willing to solve social situations, to defend fundamental rights. And we've also seen this phenomena where judges have much more freedom to solve cases in case, even when they have to undergo or contravene some laws. So basically, this freedom that judges have allowed to, acknowledge multi-species families. And in order to acknowledge a multi-species family, what has been done is that we use as legal tool the right of having free personality. So just to give you an idea of this type of right, libre desarrollo de la personalidad is the right for every person to develop their own life, develop their own capacities and receive respect for their individual decisions about how life should be. So this right defends the right to every person to choose what type of life you want, what type of family you want. And in relation to multi-species families, this aspect of this law includes the right of people to choose if they want or do not want an animal at home, but also if those people want or do not want to form a family where their integrants are also animals. So by using this law, they've actually seen that there are different rulings that are actually defending multi-species families. And we've seen that actually in relation to cases where, for example, a building block has forbid a person to have a dog. They demand, neighbors demand that they have to take away the dog, give it in adoption, just because most of the tenants don't like pets, right? Or animals. There've been cases also where, in a building block, they forbid for animals to be in the elevator, right? So that people that have dogs needed to use stairs, 10, 15 floors, So this is unfair for these people and these animals. So they've said that this constitutional right actually needs to be protected, even if for that they need to not vulnerate, but they need to limit the right of property of the others. So they've even said that. So that is the way in which they've been developing the protection of multi-species families. And just to finish, I just wanted to mention a case that's very interesting. This is the Clifford dog case. And this case is what I conclude my article with. It's a judge that protected the right of having access to drugs for a dog in a multi-species family. So in Colombia, let me explain, there's a drug, a medicine, it's called phenobarbital. So phenobarbital, and this is to control epilepsy. And in Colombia, the only access you have for this drug is established by the state. So the only person that can provide and sell this drug is the Colombian state and not private, right? No. So what happens in 2020, due to COVID and because in an efficiency in state, the stock of phenobarbital was, was over. And Clifford, this dog, was affected because Clifford suffered from epilepsy. So idiopathy and epilepsy. So when this drug, was not available, the life of Clifford was at risk. So Clifford's family did a constitutional, effort in law to be able to have access to this drug, to keep on giving it to Clifford. And during this legal process, the judge established and acknowledged that this was a multi-species family. This dog is part of the family nucleus, and the lack of this drug is actually putting at risk the life of this dog. And putting the life of the dog in risk means we're vulnerating the right to having a family union of this family. And thus the judge ordered that in 48 hours, this family could acquire the drug and give it to Clifford so that Clifford could continue with his treatment. And that I thought was so interesting, right? Especially with the efficiency that the judge acted upon. And stories like Petunia's and Clifford's, I think they show us the importance of protecting animals, but also protecting them by using interesting mechanisms, right? By doing some sort of experiments and using the law as a laboratory where we can start to defend animals in very creative manners and ways that little by little, we will be including animals within a legal framework that will be much more effective. So this is the article. Hopefully, you liked it, or you'll like it once you read it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marcia. So now we have 20 minutes that we're going to open up the session so that panelists can ask questions to each other. And then after that, we have another 20 minutes for the audience to pose questions to the panelists. I'll start with two questions. And it's to all the panelists. Yep, we're good. So the first one is, I'm a historian, so it's a question about the history of your subfield. We have 3 legal scholars and 1 archaeologist on the panel, and so I want to know your thoughts about what explains the emergence of animal law and subfields such as zooarchaeology that has a kind of a longer history but it was usually seen as a technique rather than as a subfield over the past few decades. Why now and not before? What's behind this rising interest in animals in your subfields? I'm posing this question because I think it might be helpful to members of the audience who are not very familiar with animal law to get a sense of how these fields have this subfield have developed over time. Marcia, could you hear the question? Yeah, Diego? Still there?
Yes.
Okay. So that's the first one. The second one has to do with a topic that the ReVista issue did not focus on, which is industrial animal farming. There's one article by Carolina Maciel titled "The Legal Protection of Animals in Brazil" that touches on this a little bit, but most other texts, including mine, seem to be more interested in wildlife. There are some exceptions, like the cases that you just described, Marcia, but in general, the issue seems to be focusing on wildlife rather than farm animals. And obviously, there's nothing wrong with that, but I do think that industrial animal farming presents one of the greatest challenges to animal law in the emergence of novel legal frameworks based on it. So let me just give you a couple of facts. There are approximately 23 billion chickens, 1.5 billion cattle, 1.2 billion sheep, and 1 billion pigs in the world. The combined weight of the world's cattle, chickens, and pigs exceeds the weight of all wild animals and humans combined. And Latin America is at the center of this phenomenon. Although the region contains only 8% of the world's population, it produces over a quarter of its beef, 24% of its poultry, 11% of the world's milk, and 7% of its pork. And I don't need to tell, I'm not saying anything that most of you don't know, but most of these animals lead short, brutal, miserable lives. How can animal law, this is the question, how can it help transform industrial farming in the lives of these sentient, intelligent animals? Mind you, many societies like Peru or Colombia, where notions such as, for example, a multi-species family might be acceptable, may find the idea of generalized vegetarianism far less appealing. Would lawmakers and Supreme Court support bills and lawsuits that threaten a multi-billion-dollar industry that represents about half of Latin America's agricultural GDP? So I would like to hear your thoughts on this. And if you should, maybe we should proceed with these questions, and then each one of you can ask questions to the other panelists. Does that work?
Yeah.
See? So.
Should I start?
Yeah, go for it.
These questions I could talk about these questions like for hours. So I'll try to be short. Why animal law now? Actually, animal law has been developing for the last decades around the world. There are like now several law schools that have had, for example, animal law courses now since several years now. Maybe even Harvard was probably the first university that had an animal law course, and it started to spread around the world because the issues related to animals are issues that go back way in history. They're issues that we've had for many years, and the development of animal law goes with the hand of advocacy for animal rights. So, and goes with the hand of advance in discussions on ethics and how we should relate to animals, and is it fair the way we treat them? Is it, and all these discussions go way back. So I think important things have occurred in the past. For example, Peter Singer's animal liberation had a huge impact, but before him, many scholars were talking about these issues. And now in Latin America, animal law is maybe following a similar path as in the US, in the sense that several law schools are offering the course. veterinarian schools are becoming interested, so their students are assisting animal law courses in the law school, or even in the veterinary school, there's a course on animal legislation. Also, there are courses now on animal ethics that is very important because a general understanding of animal law could be, for example, in Spain, of the law that regulates bullfighting. You could think that that's animal law because it's a law that regulates an activity with animals. But animal law's purpose is to protect animals, to advance their protection, and to improve their lives. So that goes with the hand with animal ethics. And that is a discussion of why are we treating these sentient beings this way? And then that links to the question on CAFOs, that's industrial farming. The US has a huge problem with CAFOs, and North Carolina, South Carolina, I can't remember which one, is full of CAFOs, or both, and many other states as well. In Latin America, we also have CAFOs, but the problem is that animal law, the law is always behind advances in ethics and morality, right? But there are legislation regarding animal welfare to improve the situation of animals in these horrible factories. For example, Chile celebrated a treaty with the European Union in 2003, where the European Union said, okay, you want to do business with us? Perfect, but you have to develop legislation on animal welfare because the European Union is the region in the world that has developed most of this type of legislation. It's very important for the European Union as it started off as a way to uniform the market within the European Union. So Chile said, oh, perfect, I want to go into business with the EU. And so it developed legislation that it incorporated like the international standards on animal welfare. But what's the problem with these regulations? It's that they're very hard to enforce first. Then the person that has to, like the agency that has to inspect these industries is a governmental agency, and it's the same agency that at the same time promotes animal agriculture. So you see like a conflict of interest because it's the same one that has to check the zoos, check the aquariums, check farms, check everything related to animals. So obviously there is conflicts there. And then it's obviously impossible to inspect a farm because it's an industrial facility that has millions of chickens in it. Like, well, how are they going to check if each chicken welfare is being protected? You know, that's impossible. So animals live these horrible lives. So what can we do? Like, yeah, lawyers can use animal welfare legislation, try to improve it, and try to use different creative paths to improve things for animals. But consumers also have a huge say in this issue of not consuming these products. But the thing is now, consumers know, like, even if you don't care about animals, climate change and the environmental emergency, everybody has to agree that stopping not consuming animal products is a way to improve the planetary situation, right? But people don't want to do it because you're getting into people's habits, right? Something very personal. But I think we have to just kind of like assume that it's something we have to do because there's not enough resources, there's not enough land, there's not enough water. And even farming now, like extensive farming, there's a book that recently came out by a scientist saying that even if we move towards extensive farming, not industrial, there's not enough space on the planet to have farmed animals in fields. We would eat up all of them, like wild nature and parks, to have animals roaming around. And the scientists saying we can't do that. That's why we have to eat plant-based diets. If people don't like the vegan concept because it sounds, well, okay, then use vegan, plant-based. But it's what we have to do. But people don't want to do it. But do we want to keep living on this planet or what? So, I mean, the law can do as much, philosophers can do as much, and even scientists that are saying, hey, this is the carbon footprint of what you're eating. But like people dissociate from all of this, but at the end, consumers have a say in this. When we go to a supermarket, we can choose a pack of lentils versus a kilogram of beef, but we're not doing that. So it's something we have to check ourselves.
Does anyone else, ¿alguno de ustedes tiene algún comentario sobre las preguntas? Marce.
Yeah, I agree with Macarena in this sense. I would like to add to that. I consider that animal welfare, animal rights is a very new concept and in Latin America, and I think we should be aware of this question because animal welfare and animal rights have been discussed in Europe since 1917, the same in the US, but in Latin America, this was not the case. I think that many people don't know about the concept of what is animal welfare, what are welfare standards. I think that in order to begin the discussion of animal rights and animal welfare in Latin America, sadly, here Macarena, Diego, and I, we are giving the first steps in our countries. No, and we have the task of education first, and how we will explain animal welfare and that animals are sentient beings to a huge population that we are now in Latin America. That is a big question because we are facing different populations, we are facing different classes, so economic classes. We cannot, even our discourse, we cannot copy and paste a discourse from the United States of Europe into the Latin America society. I think that are questions that we have to be thinking about, no? Because in our countries are so diverse, our countries have different cultures, and also economic difficulties are so spread out everywhere. So yeah, that are questions also that we can have into account, no? I don't know if someone wants to say.
Can I add something?
Yeah, go ahead.
Another thing interesting to take into account is actually the question of how we relate to animals and how we should consider them or recognize them isn't so foreign to Latin America if we think of our indigenous communities. Indigenous communities in Latin America and worldwide have had a much different approach to animals in general than the one that the West has had. So for example, just to give an example, I recently spoke to a Chilean, well, she's a Mapuche activist, and she was telling me how the Mapuche people in her community relate to animals. So for example, a very important difference to the West with CAFOs is that first, they don't eat meat every day. You know, eating meat is something very special and for certain situations because they know that it implies killing an animal, and they view animals as an other, not like in the West where we view the animal as a thing, and that's what our civil codes regulate, animals as things. So they view the animals as another. And in her community, she told me that they wait till the animal is old to kill the animal and to eat the animal. They don't kill young animals as we do in the West. In the West, we're killing chicks that are, I don't know how old they are, but
6 months
or less. We're eating veal. Everybody likes ternera so much. Nobody thinks, what is ternera? Ternera is a baby cow. You know, we're eating very young animals. We're eating babies. And for example, that in that group of Mapuches, of her community of indigenous people, they have this very different relationship. And then they use every part of the animal. And then they kind of like recognize that they're taking a life and kind of like doing something in exchange for what they're doing. But in the West, we just take lives and capos every day. It's like properties, one animal, another, don't recognize them as others. So I think Latin American people, it wouldn't take, I don't think people would, it's so hard for people to understand that the animal is sentient or the animal is another. Because people aren't stupid in Latin America. I mean, we are relating to animals constantly. People in Latin America are surrounded by animals and biodiversity, you know, but obviously it does take a lot of education and effort. But I think that We can learn a lot from indigenous traditions and their way to relate and their way of sustainability and their way of protecting nature and use those examples.
¿Alguno de ustedes tiene algún otro comentario? También pueden formular preguntas el uno al otro. Diego.
Sí, nada más me gustaría comentar un poco.
I just wanted to say something regarding to what you mentioned about you tend to give more preference to theoretically to what is animal rights for animals that are submitted to industrial, aspects. Respecting Chile, in Chile, what we've been able to see very specifically is that apparently it would seem to have more academic development creatively, literally, for animals, but not as much with the industrial, with this world tendency to give more, priority to animal life. I'm not sure which are the reasons behind this, but I'm sure that the circumstances, of biodiversity of Chile. Chile has a vast biodiversity with animals, but it has endemic species because Chile, from the geographical viewpoint, would seem like an island that has flourished in its development of very different species, compared to other countries. Even though we have that, it's crucial to defend these perspectives, not only with ReVista, specialized articles, research, but also, in the front rows, defending advocacy, generating some sort of professionalization, in terms of normalization of the existence of animal rights in the, schools of law in Chile, so that these become a part of the legal, justice speech. And I think that, this could be regulated and limited by some of the legal schools. So I think this could be applied by other perspectives as well. Animal rights should be taken as a cultural circumstance, and it needs to be taken seriously in decision taking, not only in the fact that, the existence of, better regulations, but also by giving resources. So that's important too. An example, what happens with Chile is the second place in the world for salmon production. So salmon is bred, and so Norway is the #1 producer. So they use 0.1 antibiotics per ton. In Chile, recently, we've been creating regulations that have to do with, limit the amount of antibiotics that flow in the bodies of these fish. So thinking about development, academic or dogmatic, about the industrial apiculture, so and different fisheries. So for example, in fisheries, there's an article in the general fishing law that prohibits, applying unnecessary pain on or suffering on these living beings. So taking into account a salmon, right? A salmon can travel 10,000 kilometers in its life. And if it's in a pond in the ocean, that is applying suffering to the salmon. So that norm establishes that because the animal isn't traveling, it is causing suffering to it because of its, natural life cycle. So that's why we need to take into account, that's why I was saying it's important for legal courses to be taught in legal university and in law schools, to really theorize, but also apply it. And really, that will contribute to the advancement of animal well-being, and and it could attain new cultural laws that will allow us to contribute to different predominant circumstances that will help us nationally for animals. And this is a very important work that we've been trying to do from our foundation, but it's a lot of work. So that's why, as I said, we need to create new legal courses at universities, because otherwise it won't get out. And in Chile, there's a university that has been teaching this course on a regular basis, but really, despite the fact that this doesn't have a cultural reality, it could contribute to its reality. And this is a challenge that, as animal lawyers in this region, we face many challenges. And I think that this is a good first step, right? To move forward, with this training and, permeating this in the culture. Thank you.
We should open the floor to the audience.
And the other authors.
And the other authors, yeah. So if you have questions, si tienen preguntas, uno para el otro, adelante. Y también
So if you have questions, please do not hesitate. We have an open Q&A chat, and you can pose your questions there. I think we have 2 questions.
I can wait if you want.
No, we can start here.
When you
Yeah, introduce yourself and then pose the question. We have 2.
Okay, my name is Juan Pablo Cárdenas. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Pennsylvania. I study ecocriticism, animal and plant studies, and natural phenomena studies and literature from the 19th and 20th century. Thank you very much. And now, excuse me, now I'm going on board with the Radcliffe Fellow at Harvard. So I hope to see you around. This has been really fascinating. I don't necessarily have a question. I have 3 things quickly that I want to go over that I've been thinking about. One is, what are the dangers of us when thinking of animal law, of anthropomorphization? I'm sorry, I can't say that word in English because I tried. We have Estrellita, we have the dog. All of these animals seem to have been brought into our realm, into the house, and they have been anthropomorphized. And how can we think about how can we zoomorphize ourselves the other way instead? And I don't know if that's just putting it out there. Just thinking about what you were saying about plant-based, although I very much agree with the industrial problem that we have with animal consumption, industrial plant stuff is also really horrible. It also consumes so much water, just keeping oranges and throughout these droughts, and, and hopefully the next ReVista will be plants. Please do let me know, because they're not far away. And I think that what I'm going to is that everything is incredibly connected. And then the third point I want to think about is what you were exactly saying about Amerindian cosmologies, where, yes, they don't eat animals every day, at least not a tapir every day, or the Curripacos and Puinaves who I worked with in the Orinoco in Venezuela and Colombia, but they will eat grubs every day or other insects and stuff. And so my thought is, like, can we, without appropriating violently, how the West has done, as you say, learn? Is there microfauna that we can eat, like insects, for example, that are super healthy, need much less antibiotics than cows or other larger animals, and we can grow them smaller, and maybe just maybe they don't feel as much pain, or their biology isn't as similar as ours, they're not as large brains, et cetera, or that's another bias, brain size. So sorry for blurting out all of these things. I'm just very excited to hear everything. So if anyone wants to touch on any of that, great. But I know I loaded a lot. So.
Jump in. Marcia.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking that question here. But in relation to anthropomorphize the animal, I think that, and I think I will try to put all your questions together in only one question that is, for me, law and the establishment of rights and all this legal system is part of a moral progress. Because if we don't have law, we will have other kinds of rules and other kinds of systems in order to control our behavior and have the ability to live together. I think that the law is the most effective one, because what we are doing through the law is to give all the power to the state. So the state is able to use the police to put you in jail if you kill a person, or the police is able to make an embargo in your bank account if you owe money to other person. So first of all, the law is the most effective way to control behavior. The question is only able to control behavior of humans towards another human, or we can use the law also to control the behavior of one human to animals or to the environment? That is one question. I think that we can use the law to control our behavior towards other animals and the environment. But the other question is, but what about animals? Animals can be part of this legislation. Can animals create law? Well, that is another question. We can say, okay, animals are able to participate in the creation of law, to fulfill rights, to be able to hold rights and to have duties. That is a question that now the theory is resolving, but at least we know that animals are able to hold rights. So they are passive subjects of law. That is first, no? So in this way, you are not anthropomorphizing the animal, giving duties. For instance, you will pay taxes, etc. But you are saying, you animals that have this capacity to suffer, through the law, we will protect you. So I don't consider that that is anthropomorphized. But what about, that is one, but what about indigenous communities? I think that there are a lot of, I think that we don't have to idealize what is indigenous communities, indigenous perspectives, etc. Because at least I came from a very, I don't know, I live in Cusco, so I am surrounded of a lot of from indigenous communities or people that live in the field, and that they have these Indian perspectives. And I cannot say that we can generalize that all communities are good with environment or they are more peaceful than Occidental or Western cultures. But what I would like to say is that we have to, we know that animal rights, animal welfare is a very Western idea. No, it was developed in Europe and in the United States. But I don't think that is a problem including indigenous people from Latin America into this idea, because I consider that animal rights, animal welfare are part also of this moral development of humanity, of humankind as a whole. So I don't have problem. I think that if we say, oh, in this legislation about animal rights and animal welfare, we will make an exception to indigenous people. I think that that is a wrong idea, because we cannot separate these communities from moral development. No, I think that this is maybe there are indigenous people with more aware about nature, but also there are indigenous communities that are not aware about animal suffering. So I think that this is like I don't know. I think that this is a very interesting topic. It has to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, but I don't consider that there is a problem to give this idea of human rights and animal rights to indigenous communities. I don't know if that is understandable. Thank you.
Diego, ¿quiere decir algo?
Sí, muchas gracias.
Yes, thank you very much. I just wanted to add something and just leave an idea on the table so that we could discuss it further. Basically, two pillars. The first one is the limitation that is invoked by animal use to include animals within the moral community. And then I'm going to talk about the anthropomorphization of animals. So the first part, we try to consider that animal abolitionism is a theoretical conduct in favor of the human and animal dignity and their inclusion in the moral community of humankind. So I think that, and this could be controversial, so that's why I'm phrasing it as a question, right? So personally, I think that probably feelings can be seen as a sort of undesirable thing for humans. Why? Because feeling for an animal or a human is a quality of a human or non-animal being that doesn't depend of the animal. For example, like Gary Francione, who quoted Vinan by saying, the intellectual qualities, considering intellectual qualities of an animal, could be some sort of migration. And you can see it, how you can analyze feelings or feeling as something that could include or exclude animals from a moral, community. And it's a complex and even elegant way of distinguishing human beings. So for example, we can talk about speciesism. So these are circumstances that don't depend on everything. So feeling could give way to some, certain non-human beings that have feelings. So you could ask, okay, what is the sense of a sponge? For example, a sponge that lives in the ocean, does it have feelings? So it's very personal, right? And I think that every single way of life has a way to be lived, has some sort of natural propulsion or boost, that exists from its birth until its decease. So respecting a non-human life, is, it's a complex and elegant way to stigmatize. And from another viewpoint, I think, and this could be very polemic, right? What I'm gonna say, and this is an open question, right? Acknowledging subjective rights for humans and animals, this is something that we need to seek at short and medium term, right? Acknowledging these rights for animals, could have some theoretical complexities, but that could be overwhelmed. So, for example, we cannot, for an animal that cannot pay taxes, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have the right to, not be heard. So the Constitution creates some protection of the dignity of that individual. But I also think that on one side, that also can lead us to social anthropomorphization. So basically, we talk about dignity in the sense that an elephant, an ant, or a sponge, it anthropomorphizes that individual. So that's a circumstance that these non-anthropomorphous or yes, anthropomorphized animals, despite that this is a legal resource or recourse that will allow us to help those. So is it a way of anthropomorphizing? Why? Because every single animal has different codes, how they interact, how they create their communities. And in that sense, technology of subjective law is a technology that exists within the code of humans. So, if we apply these rights on animals, then we will allow to intensify the protection, but also that implies some sort of transformation or modification of the reason of power that they will exert on other animals, because we are imposing a code on animals. We're under the pretext that we're freeing them, we're imposing a code on them. So as I said before, especially, in law schools, we need to keep on boosting courses, normalizing the existence of animal law, for decision taking, for normalization, professionalization, to save human dignity, but also never forget philosophical, judicial philosophy, and work with new perspective or new legal technologies that will allow us to give better degrees of freedom for human animals faced with human beings. And in that sense, I do not perceive the imposition of subjective rights of humans upon others. So it should be seen as something more intermediary, something that would allow to give a more intense freedom of animals, not applying just human systems to them. Lance?
I'm obviously not an expert because I'm a lawyer, but the research I've been able to read regarding insects, consumption of insects, and like the carbon footprint of what we eat is that, and I think the Animal Law Policy Program has written about this. So if you're interested, maybe you can check out the website. But insects would also needed to be raised industrially. And so the impacts on nature of industrially feeding the population with insects isn't very clear what that would also imply. And regarding the ethical matters, there is research where insect sentience, it's probably there are some insects that maybe are sentient. It's not clear yet.
It sounded like I said they
because sentience is probably a matter of like degree. So as in most things in evolution, so they're probably, but it's still not clear. But we know that many other animals are sentient, right? And the other thing is that I can share this really interesting research that there's an article that, and there's a video, like a 4-minute video that explains the carbon, like the footprint of a lot of different things we eat. And it starts with like certain fruits, and it has very little footprint, and it not only includes emissions, different emissions, but also land use and like other factors. And the worst thing that we can eat is beef. Before beef is sheep, and then it's like
pork.
Yeah, and at the beginning of that, very little emissions is vegetable things like some fruits. And it's very interesting because it not only includes like methane emissions, but also like land use and other aspects. And it's like, it's really great. And you know, some things we didn't know because Carlos is really coffee drinker. Is coffee and chocolate are kind of way up in the high in the footprint. And that's something very interesting because it's because of the fertilizers they use with coffee that have a lot of emissions, like emissions, and chocolate is the same. So that's why it's important to choose coffee and chocolate that are like ecological and from sources where they don't use these types of fertilizers. And chocolate, the problem is like they chop down parts of the jungle, you know, for this. So it's very interesting. I can share that research if you're interested, in the video that shows like the footprint of a lot of things we eat.
You have a question?
I've had the advantage of hearing some comments, responses, so I have 2 very quick comments, I promise, and then a question. One has already been touched on, but the first one I want to say is that an overemphasis on pain as a metric for judging animals, our relationship to animals, is a kind of anthropocentrism in itself, and that pain is important in humans, and there's no reason to think pain and suffering, there's no reason, absent clear evidence, that it isn't likewise in animals. I'm not certainly arguing against torturing animals, but I just don't think an exclusive focus on pain is the right way to go in terms of animal. It also leads to a kind of animal welfareism, where we focus on making sure you do no harm, but then you de-emphasize the fact that these animals have lives that matter. The second point I want to make is that I don't think we should go too much in the vertebrate centrism mode. That many animals, insects in particular, I'm a biologist, I'm a retired biologist. Insects in particular have lives, but all animals have lives that are meaningful to them. I can argue strongly for honeybees, I think it's clear for lobsters, but those are only because research has been done in those areas. And you go to other animals, you're going to find similar things. So I strongly argue that insects, just or grubs or whatever, should not be diminished as being of importance. So now my question is about the very interesting talk you gave on the law in the developing law in Ecuador, and I wonder how it relates or might relate to individuals who are distressed as a result of habitat loss, but for whom maybe those individuals can or cannot be identified as such.
Individuals like maybe can be identified because we can't see them?
You could say I'm talking about protecting a habitat, but I'm going to focus on the individual animals in that habitat and try to ask whether there's a legal argument for these individuals unnamed in the habitat itself that need to be protected, rather than the habitat as a whole.
Yeah. First,
the consequence becomes the same, but I think
it's fantastic to hear a biologist saying these things, because lawyers, like when we have these type of cases, we always need scientists on our side to like convince the courts, like, hey, like this animal has this life. For example, in the Estrellita case, we had filed like a expert report from a Colombian primatologist that is an expert in woolly monkeys, because as you say, it's not that Estrellita is sentient, as I mentioned in my talk. It's that a lot of animals have, they have their societies, they have their lives, they have their friends, they have their families, they have their way of living, and some of them are more relatable to us because Estrellita is a primate, so we can understand how they live in societies and have a very deep connection with their mothers. But as I didn't catch your name, but as
Jerry Revere,
as Jerry just mentioned, even insects have their own lives, and scientists are studying bees, or there's more information on bees, but in general, insect sentience and their ways of lives. Regarding the right to habitat, actually, it's one of the rights that the court mentioned, as the court mentioned like a list of rights, one of them being the right to habitat. But obviously, the court didn't develop this right. So we'll have to see how this develops in Ecuador. But I personally believe that animals can hold the right to property, for example, if we view having certain things as property. And as such, I also think that animals can have the right to their habitat. How the law can recognize this? Well, we would have to first, I think, recognize that animals are like autonomous communities that have the right to govern themselves, and where human interference should be non-existent, or at least interfere only when we can help them. For example, with emergencies like fires, wildfires, or when animals are sick, and help them in droughts and stuff like that, but not interfere in their societies. So I shouldn't be able to go in to a chimpanzee community and say, you know what, I'm taking this chimp and putting them in that zoo, or I'm taking these chimps and putting them in that national park, because in that national park, now I need chimpanzees, because those chimpanzees have a society that we don't fully understand. We know a lot about it, but we don't fully know how to understand. So I think the law could do this, but I think we're kind of far from that, because we still consider that animals are property. We're still very focused on animal welfare, more than animal rights or other different ways of viewing animals. But what we do know is that Latin America, compared to other regions in the world, is the region that has more cases regarding animal rights than any other region in the world. Judges in Latin America, we could say, are braver, are more flexible in the application of the law, and there are much more cases. For example, you're from Spain, and we've lived in Spain for many years. In Spain, there's practically no advances in animal rights. No judge has ever said that an animal is a person, or the habeas corpus can be applied to an animal, or anything like that. In Latin America, there are many cases. Obviously, it's still a field that is growing, and we need more judges. But there are advances, and I think that it's something to feel positive about in Latin America. So I think that judges, maybe if judges in Ecuador continue developing the Estrellita case and continue advancing and how we're seeing animals, and they could apply it and say, you know what, the animals and the Amazon have the right to a habitat, and this is how it's going to be applied. Because we have to enforce it. It can't just be something symbolic, like, oh yeah, animals have the right to a habitat and just leave it at that. No, it has to be enforceable. So if there's a violation, there has to be a place where we could go and say, hey, this is being violated, you know. But I mean, there's different paths, and I think the rights of nature might be a path we can use, but among many other paths, as Diego said, for example, he had a different strategy for the Victorias, different strategy for Sandai. And Ecuador now, people are saying rights of nature can be a path, you know. Thing is, we have to use different legal instruments to try to advance things, because you just wait and sit down and wait. Okay, I'm just gonna wait for people to recognize all animals in the civil code and the Constitution as persons with the right to life. We're gonna be sitting down a long time.
I'd push back just a little. May I make a comment?
Yeah, we're running out of time, but yes, please do.
I'd push back against a word that you've used several times now that's very fashionable, and that is sentience. It tends to go immediately for many people to the idea of what's going on in the interiority of the mind, and that it's basically an unknowable, and then you're left with, and then it gets taken over by philosophers who start thinking about mentation and cognition, and you get all these words that they claim animals are unable to, because of course only philosophers can do these sorts of things, and there are few people. And the whole field of psychology itself, in my opinion, is somewhat suspect in terms of animal issues, and that we should focus more, instead of on sentience, and sapience and so forth, on something more like way of being, where being itself is not a being, but it is something that all creatures should be thought of as having. And we can talk about different ways of being, but they're all ways of being that living creatures have. And then you're now talking about a kind of comportment rather than a kind of intentionality. So a deal of interacting with the world, more of an ecological approach, but more in a holistic sense than in an ecological sense. And you start to value life in that sense, rather than focusing on psychology, which I think is problematic.
The thing
as
is,
much as you can talk about individuals too, in the sense that I'm talking about, without psychologizing that term.
Yeah, I totally agree. But the problem we have in the law is that the law talks about animal suffering, and it talks about sentience.
I understand.
So that's like the advance we have. Like, you have to imagine that in the law we didn't have anything, right? We just had like animals are property. You know, they're human property. Human can do practically whatever they want with animals. So that kind of advance to, hey, animals suffer. You know, animals have feelings and can suffer, and so the law started to recognize, okay, I'll recognize that. So in the slaughterhouse, we have to do something so the animals don't suffer as much, because they still suffer. And so that kind of developed a bit. And so some legal orders started recognizing, okay, using the word sentience, like, okay, we recognize that animals are sentient. So that's why we use it a lot, because it's what we have right now in the law. But I agree with you that it's more than that. You know, it's not just sentience, it's beings, it's ways of life. It's a lot of things that we don't even understand fully, that we can't even grasp, you know, but the law works with concepts, and we have to kind of, the law is like so behind on this that we're still talking about sentience, you know, suffering. And that's why these advances, like, for example, the multi-species family, when a judge says, you know, that animal can be a daughter or a son, are like big advances, because we only have like these animal like laws against cruelty, welfare regulations that is all about reducing this suffering, unnecessary suffering. And then we have certain progress, like in Ecuador, when they say, you know what, the rights of nature apply to animals. And that obviously sounds fantastic, but we have to obviously develop that, and that has to be accompanied and supported by policy and a lot of other things. But at least in Latin America, we have judges that are saying, you know what, this animal is a non-human person. This animal has fundamental rights. There are some advances in that sense that go beyond sentience, where they're recognizing the animal as a person, you know, like another, like with fundamental rights, different to humans' rights, but similar in that sense.
Person. Okay, fine.
Well,
I think
we can talk about that further.
Yeah, we can continue the conversation with food. Thank you so much for the questions. Thank you so much for your contributions, your presentations, and let's eat.